Okay, one thing I should say, that since this was so last minute, didn't realize, forgot that I was supposed to come up with a title for this. So Seth has come up with Peterson Pontifications. I should have told him, though, I do touch on Pontius Pilate at the beginning. So it could have been Peterson Pontifications on Pontius Pilate. So, and you just have to say that 10 times very quickly. So today I am going to take you to Israel. This is a trip that Nancy and I took in 2018, I think it was. Melody was there. And actually, strangely enough, we bumped into Pierce's dad, Tim, on the streets of Jerusalem. He wasn't on our trip. So he was with the University of Illinois group, and we saw them with all their orange, and we connected with them, and Tim was part of that group. So we happened to bump into Tim on the streets of Jerusalem in that trip. So it was kind of wild. So anyhow, so I don't need this right now, so let me put that down. So I'm going to start I'm going to do a tour beginning with two cities is all I'm covering today. And I don't want it to be a travel log. So each city has a little bit of their own theme. This one, Caesarea Maritima, be transformed, not conformed, is the theme for this one. And so so this was our trip in 2018. And, oh, that's the wrong thing. There we go. And this is where I do need the pointer. It's a little hard to see, but this is Israel in the time of Jesus. And so Caesarea Maritima is right up there where that star is, right on the Mediterranean Sea. I do have a close-up, but whoop, I've been going the wrong way. There we go. So again, you see that star up right on the Mediterranean Sea, which was called the Great Sea at that time. And so the very first thing that we saw when we arrived at Caesarea Maritima, this was our first stop on the tour, Melody remembers it, I'm sure, is we came across this stone. And, you know, I can't read Latin, and many of the letters have crumbled away, but the name etched onto the limestone, and the second line there says, if you look closely, it does say Pilatus, as in Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judah. And this image, somebody went in and kind of showed what the missing words probably are. So you see down below there, the Pontius Pilate there, and it says prefect of Judea. So, so outside of the Bible and other writings that mention Pilate, this stone provided the first concrete evidence, or in this case, limestone evidence, that Pontius Pilate, the man who condemned Jesus to death, walked this earth. And Nancy and I, there's Nancy there in the red, we saw the replica when we came to what remains of Caesarea Maritima. Like I said, it's perched on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This was our first day in Israel, and the jet lag had yet to set in. In fact, I felt strangely energized, even though we had just flown across the ocean. And so the sky was blue, the water was blue, just a perfect day. And now the Pilate stone that we saw was actually a replica, because the original was discovered on the site in 1961 while archaeologists were digging around an ancient theater in Caesarea Maritima. There's the theater. That is not the archaeologist. That's not Indiana Jones. That is Illinois Ken. So people who know Ken Cuffey, who led our group. And so it was found that they were digging around at this ancient theater. And according to the inscription, the stone was part of a dedication for a temple to worship Tiberius, Emperor Tiberius there, where you got a statue of him and what he might have looked like if he was walking our streets today. And so, but then later in the 4th century, the stone was then reused in a staircase behind an ancient theater. So this stone kind of bounced around. So it's kind of, a miracle that this stone would be used in all these building projects and remain intact with Pilate's name pretty visible and be discovered years later. It's really remarkable. So as the stone indicates, Pilate was the prefect, who was a governor of Judea, and his home base was in Caesarea Maritima. And Herod the Great built this city. He wanted to rival the cities of Rome. In fact, Herod was obsessed with all things Roman. His goal with Caesarea Maritima was to create a magnificent Roman-style city. And it had all the proper features. It had a temple dedicated to Caesar. It had a palace, a theater, an aqueduct to supply water, and it had a hippodrome, which is what that is, which is actually a hippodrome is a place where they race chariots and horses and not hippos. Although Romans liked exotic spectacles, I wouldn't be surprised if they raised hippos there too. But most spectacular was the harbor that Herod constructed at Caesarea Maritima using concrete that could harden underwater. So this technology was way ahead of its time. And the harbor was believed to be able to be large enough to handle 300 ships. So Herod thought big, he built big in the hopes that he would be remembered forever. Unfortunately, the way we remember him is a little bit different than as a builder. We think of him as being a pretty nasty guy, which he was. But he thought the way to be remembered was to imitate the Romans, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But if you go to the book of Romans, you read something completely different. In Romans 12:2, Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So talking about conform, a form is a shape. It's like a pattern. And when we conform, we're shaping our thoughts and ideas to match someone else's. But Paul warns us against shaping our thoughts to the pattern of the world. He says instead to be transformed. And that means to change the shape of your thoughts. And instead of allowing our minds to just be mindlessly molded to the world around us, Paul urges us to allow our minds to be shaped by God, to see ourselves as the clay, and God is the potter who works with us as the clay. So Herod was a conformist of historical proportions as he followed the style of Rome. Pontius Pilate, coming back, this is a very famous painting of Pontius Pilate there in the middle. I think that's his wife kind of walking off to the right there because she knows what a mistake he's making. But Pilate was also famous for conforming. When Jesus was brought before Pilate as a prisoner, the prefect actually wanted to release him because he thought he wasn't guilty of anything serious. He'd been arrested for blasphemy. But when the crowd began to shout, crucify him, Pilate crumbled like old stone and he gave in. He conformed to the crowd and Jesus died. Paul, on the other hand, was really the ultimate nonconformist. He never stopped talking about Jesus, even when he was beaten, even when he was struck by stones, even when he was in prison for his actions. And ironically, he was put in prison for 2 years in Caesarea Maritima. This is the same city where the Pilate stone was discovered in Herod's city. He was there for 2 years before eventually appealing to Rome, and then he ends up being taken to Rome, and that's where he died. But he spent 2 years at that site. So now we saw a bit of the theater, which has been preserved pretty good, but the palace at the edge of the water this is pretty much what remains of a lot of the palace. This was his pool right here. Doesn't look like a very, not a very, what do they call it, infinity pools. I wouldn't call that. It's a very finite pool, not an infinity pool. And it can get a good picture of what happens to legacies like Herod's. They crumble and wear away like old stone. Kingdoms and rulers on earth do not last. Kings and prefects do not survive. And when we try to conform to the world, when we chase after fame and wealth and success, it doesn't last. It erodes away. And this is a good symbol of what remains of what was really probably a magnificent palace at the time. But we will live forever with God when we allow him to transform us. So, and then kind of a reminder of that is in Psalm 39, 5-7. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure, like Herod. Surely everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. So the psalmist knows where the lasting hope is. It's not in palaces and the things we build here on earth. The Jesus rock is far stronger than the Pilate rock because Jesus is a rock that doesn't crumble. It's a rock that will remain standing throughout all eternity. And we too will remain throughout eternity if we hold on to the rock. We just have to be holding on to the right rock, not the pilot rock. Let's hold on to the Jesus rock. So that's the first stop. That's Caesarea Maritima. Next stop, and this was our next stop in our tour when we went to Israel in 2018. And I should recommend it. I know they have had 2 now through the Urbana Theological Seminary. So if you ever, I strongly recommend, if you have not been to Israel, it's a wonderful trip. But the second place we went to was Nazareth, a more familiar name to everybody. And the theme on this one, it kind of connects with the other one, but it's be reborn, not rebuked. And but I want to start. Oh, okay. Well, here's we got again the map here before I get to the beginning here. So here is it's up in Galilee. So we've got Judea here, Samaria, and then Galilee way up here by the Sea of Galilee, and Nazareth. I'm looking sideways. There it is, right there. So and I do have the next one where you do a little bit of a closer up view there, where you can see Nazareth. Whoops. Right up there. And then we got Tiberias over here, which city that big city that still exists. So that kind of orients you. But before I get into really digging into a little bit more on Nazareth, I wanted to talk just about, this was the boyhood home, which is where Jesus grew up. So I want to talk first briefly about homes. This is Nancy at our house. And we've lived in the same house now for 38 years, and we don't have any plans of moving. We've put deep roots in central Illinois, where it is very hot and humid in the summer and unbearably cold in the winter. So they take a look again, Nancy. Okay, so this was in the late 70s, early 80s. People may remember those winters were some of the worst. And just thinking about it makes my toes go numb. But in the first year of our marriage, we lived at Winfield Village in Savoy. It was brand new at that time. And one day it got down to, I think, a wind chill of minus 80. And the blizzard, it was a total whiteout. And that was the very first time in its history that the University of Illinois closed. So now I think they closed for much, they're not quite as strict as they used to be. But every so often, Nancy will say, you know, before we put roots down, when we first got married, why didn't we move to Florida? She does not like cold weather, as you can see there, with that nice little bit. I don't know how that snow ended up on the top of her head like that. But you know, now we've got roots here, and we have family, we have friends, and we have a church that we don't plan on moving. You know, the idea of moving makes me queasy because moving might just kill me. And it's the same with trees. Oop, there we go. Especially older established trees. Moving them is a major endeavor. And if you don't do it just right, you'll kill the tree. However, there's at least one variety of trees that's more adaptable to being transplanted. And those are olive trees. And we saw them in abundance in Israel. And this is in Nazareth. This was an olive tree in Nazareth. And so they were thriving all over Israel. And I was particularly impressed about what our tour guide told us about olive trees that growing in Nazareth's village. Now, this was actually a living history village. There's a modern city of Nazareth, and they have a little living history village that kind of recreates what it used to be at the time of Jesus. And our tour guide, the guy on the right, not the guy on the left, the guy on the right is actually a transplant himself. He comes from Georgia. So, you know, the southern twang seemed a little out of place in the ancient village of Israel. I'm not sure anyone spoke quite that way, but he was a tremendous guy. He really was fantastic. And he told us that an olive tree can withstand fire and can withstand drought. An olive tree can live for thousands of years and still bear forth fruit. So olive trees can also withstand being moved. He said, if you move an olive tree from one area to another, it'll reestablish its roots and begin to bear fruit once again. So olive trees are like the nomads of the arboreal world. And our guide went on to note that one of the trees in Nazareth village, I'm not sure if it's that one, it could be that one, was about 400 years old and had been moved here from Cana of wedding fame. That's where Jesus performed his first miracle. So the tree was moved from Cana to Nazareth, and it still thrives, and even in its old age. And he did say, though, you can't really figure out the age of a tree because They don't have rings. They don't have the annual rings like most trees. Olive trees don't. So you really don't know their age. But he also said the roots of an olive tree are very strong. So even if the upper portion of an olive tree is seriously damaged, new shoots from these strong roots begin to grow and to keep the tree growing. And that's how some olive trees can live to be over 1,000 years old. And the olive tree constantly regenerates itself as it undergoes a cycle of death and rebirth. So you might call these the born-again trees. And now our guide also explained, and this is a woman that was demonstrating some weaving in cotton, working with cotton. I think her name, she called herself Hannah. But so anyhow, our guide explained that the very name of the city, Nazareth, comes from the Hebrew word netzer, which means shoot or sprout. And some believe the city of Nazareth was given the name because the residents were transplants from other places like Bethlehem. So the residents of Nazareth were netzers, or new shoots and new growth in a new location. And one of the most famous transplants of all in Nazareth was the family of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. Now, this guy, he was a carpenter. He called himself Joseph. So, and if you recall, the Holy Family fled from, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but they had to flee to Egypt when Herod the Great, again, the Herod, why he got the name the Great, I don't know, but he's the same one building that palace. Herod the Great tried to hunt down baby Jesus and kill him. So when King Herod finally kicked the bucket, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus returned to Israel, but they were warned, don't come back to Bethlehem because it wasn't safe. One of Herod's sons, Archelaus, I think that's how I pronounce it, was in charge in Judea, where Bethlehem is located, and he too was a nasty piece of work. So Jesus and his family were transplanted to the village of transplants in Nazareth. But then it gets even more interesting. Our Georgian guide went on to quote Isaiah 11:1, which says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit." Now, in this verse, and there's a verse up there, Isaiah is talking about Jesus the Messiah. Jesus is the branch that will bear fruit. And as I said, the Hebrew word for branch is netzer, the same word where we get the name of Nazareth. So Jesus of Nazareth is the branch or shoot of Jesse because he's descended from Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David, and Jesus was a descendant of King David. So like the netzer that gives new life to the olive tree in Nazareth, Jesus is the branch of life who rose from the dead and brings new life to us. So he is the branch, and it all kind of fits together like a beautiful puzzle. But Jesus is also the vine. So I want to talk briefly at the end here about Jesus as the vine with Psalm 80. I only have a room for a couple of passages from this, but I'm going to read a little bit more of it here. This is Psalm 80, verses 7 to roughly 14. Restore us, God Almighty. Make your face shine on us, that we may be saved. You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. Its branches reached as far as the sea, its shoots as far as the river. Why have you broken down its walls so that all who pass by pick its grapes? Boars from the forest ravage it. Insects from the fields feed on it. Return to us, God Almighty. Look down from heaven and see. Watch over this vine. So in Caesarea Maritima, I talked about being transformed rather than being conformed. In Nazareth, it's all about being restored and reborn rather than being rebuked and rejected. And this verse is actually, this passage is really all about how Israel was transplanted from Egypt to the Promised Land. And then, they were in Egypt as slaves, and they escaped, and they got to the Promised Land. So they, too, were transplants from Egypt. And they thrived for a time in this new soil, but like any flawed, sinful human beings, the land became infested by sin and rebellion, represented by the boars from the forest. And I don't think they're talking about the B-O-R-E-S boars. They're talking about the B-O-A-R-S boars. and the insects of the field. So the psalm is pleading for God to restore the vine and replant it. They want it to be reborn like the olive tree. So, and in the connection, we got Jesus is actually the true vine. So in 15:5-8, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So in a way, the message in Caesarea Maritima, and I should say, the reason it's Maritima is there's another Caesarea Philippi. So there's a Caesarea Maritima and Philippi. But the message in Caesarea Maritima is pretty much the same as the one I'm talking about in Nazareth. Israel was transplanted from Egypt to the promised land, but they conformed to the world rather than being transformed. And their branches no longer produce fruit. The way to produce fruit is to be transformed. So put roots in Jesus. That is the way to true transformation. Take in his living water, because that is the way to regrowth and regeneration. So I'm going to end with this final image of Nancy here. They also talk about Jesus as the good shepherd. So I'll end with some sheep. There's actually sheep on both sides of the fence, as you can see there, different kind of sheep. But when Jesus came to us as God incarnate, you might say that he was a transplant. He was transplanted from heaven to earth. And someday we will all be transplants as well. We will be transplanted from earth to heaven. And that is actually a move I can embrace. Because I'm pretty sure the wind chill is not minus 80 degrees in heaven. And I think even Nancy's going to like the weather in heaven. So that's it. I should take this off.